the night that changed everything for horror fans, and even if you're not a horror fan, the night that had amazing, profound repercussions on our culture. That's quite a setup. Am I going to be able to deliver on that? And I think so. It is going to take some time and some cultural context. Okay, so lest I keep you in suspense any longer, some of you may have guessed, I am talking about the night of the summer of 1816. It's been talked about a lot. There have been movies made about it. It's in all of the history books if you're interested in these authors. It was a night in which Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, who would be the author of Frankenstein, um, her soon-to-be husband, who's currently married to somebody else at the time, we'll talk about that, Percy Shelley, who's one of the romantic poets, Percy Shelley, Mary and Percy, Lord Byron, Mary's half-sister, who's in sort of a menage a trois thing going on with her and Percy, Claire, and then John Polidori. These 5 individuals were sharing this castle in Switzerland. And it was a summer, a dark and stormy summer. There had been a volcano that erupted in Europe there, and it was having effects on the climate. And so it was a dark, colder than usual, stormy summer. They're there in the mountains. There are stories of an individual, actually called Frankenstein, the House of the Rocks, who was doing experiments on dead bodies to the south of where they were. They're in this haunted mountain. Mount Blanc is there. These locations that show up in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as well as a lot of Percy's poems and whatnot. We'll talk about more of the context here in a second, but the point is they have this competition while they're there, stuck inside this dark, cold, stormy summer into this castle. They have a competition who can frighten each other, and so they dare each other to tell ghost stories. Ultimately, we get Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the story arises called The Vampire, and we'll talk about how that arises more. But that is one of the major influences of what would be Dracula. Now, Bram Stoker, it took him to come along and give us a literary masterpiece and develop the character and everything. But the idea of a vampire in modern times, what would that look like? Very much, Bram Stoker drew that idea from this short story that was had its origins in this night. So it's truly a night that changed everything. Because I would argue that even if you're, say, a modern horror fan, if you like the slashers and the extreme whatever's coming out now, even if you would say I don't really like a vampire movie, or even that's too old school for you, you still owe everything you do like to those archetypes, to those foundational types that have come before. And even if you're not necessarily a horror fan, I say this still has important repercussions to you, because this is the night that created these symbols, these icons that are reflecting back the fears and anxieties of our culture. And a lot of those fears and anxieties are still with us from that moment on because of this cultural context that I'm going to get into now. Okay, so I've told you about the night that we want to talk about. It is important to give you some cultural context, and this might take a while, so settle in, but I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. The reason we can trace even today in the 2020s, our culture back to this moment in 1816 is because of what was going on culturally then with the Enlightenment is still with us today. Now, if you opened up a history of Western culture, Western civilization textbook, it's going to start with probably the Medo-Persians. It'll say something about the code of laws with the Code of Hammurabi and so forth. It'll spend a lot of good time on Egypt and the development of organized religion and the art and architecture and all of that. It'll spend a great deal of time on Greece, which came afterwards, because Greece is where we trace back this idea of democracy. Greece is where we trace back a lot of philosophers really developing ideas of science and math. Certainly Socrates and Plato, but even the pre-Socratics are very important in this time. Eventually, some things happened. I'll give you the dime store tour of Western civilization here. The Roman Empire. Greece is conquered. Alexander the Great unites a lot of Europe and a lot of even Western Asia. And the Roman Empire comes eventually into power. And they are immensely influenced by Greece, Greek culture. Greek culture has really been diffused out into a lot of the neighboring areas because of Alexander the Great. And the Roman Empire takes the ideas of Greece and they develop them a little bit, we get our idea of a republic. In America, in the United States, we are the republic for which it stands. We are a republic with democratically elected officials. So we can really trace a lot of the ideas, and our founding fathers certainly did, back to Rome and Greece. And the Roman Empire, if you think about Europe, suddenly just connected everything. Even though there were still separate principalities and so forth, the roads connected everything. Suddenly the world was a lot smaller, figuratively speaking, because you could travel. It was a big deal. And of course, within the Roman Empire, Christianity came about. Christ is born in the Roman Empire, and eventually, and Christianity develops. At first, Christians are persecuted heavily, but eventually, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. We develop the Roman Church from that. There's the Holy Roman Empire for a time. We still have the Holy Roman Catholic Church with us today. And schisms broke off of that. Schisms broke off of the schisms of the schisms of the schisms, to the point where you have countless Christian churches today, but it can all, be pointed back to that time period. So the Roman Empire eventually fell, though. It was very corrupt. It serves as a cautionary tale. We went from a republic to a lot of tyrants and the Caesars. We can look at it, why it fell, and have a lot of lessons learned. But as it fell, different barbarian factions and warring, people came in to conquer this part and this part and this part. Suddenly, we don't have this connected political world of the Roman Empire, but the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, still connects a lot of it. A lot of these barbarians who even conquer parts of Rome end up converting to Christianity. Particularly in France. France is considered the church's eldest daughter. That's a title that France has had throughout history. Certainly not anymore, but it's a title that France has had, because even with other countries falling, whether it's paganism or the Protestant, split, when certain countries will become Protestant and create their own churches and whatnot, France pretty much always stayed true to the Catholic Church. And that's going to come back to us later here in a moment. And this time period that I'm discussing now is what's called the Middle Ages. Medieval ages, that doesn't make it evil. The medieval is a word meaning the Middle Ages. It's sort of an Old English thing, but a lot of people mistake that. Oh, the evil ages, medieval ages. No, not evil, just Middle Ages. Just call it that. Some people call it the Dark Ages. And this is where the history books really show their political agenda, a lot of them. You do a cursory search on anything about the Western civilization, the history of it, and the Middle Ages, that's the dark times. That's the time when religion ruled and they were stymieing the sciences, and nothing could really, develop, and in art and philosophy, everything was just halted because of the evil Catholic Church. And it wasn't until the beautiful Renaissance era and the Enlightenment that people started to freely think, and in science and philosophy was once again developed, and blah, 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 blah. That's simply BS. You can easily see the political agenda within that. It is true that a lot of advances and whatnot, to a certain extent, did have to halt during what we call the Middle Ages. There were plagues. There was no longer this overall sense of peace with one connected political structure. There's wars, there's political factions and whatnot, countries emerging, fighting each other. The Library of Alexandria in Greece is burned to the ground. And this held a lot of copies of philosophies and sciences and everything like that. But you still had the monks in monasteries really trying to meticulously copy and preserve a lot of these texts from Greece, pagan texts even, that's why we still have Beowulf with us and so forth. It's owed to these monasteries. There are still wonderful philosophers and thinkers, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Erasmus, but we don't like to think, secular culture doesn't like to think about them because they have that saint word, they're affiliated with the Catholic Church anyway. And nevertheless, they were still very much doing the work of science and human intellectual progress. The Renaissance comes about, and Renaissance painters and philosophers, many of which are still Christian, still doing work for the Catholic Church. Even some of the most beautiful Renaissance paintings and sculptures are patroned and ordered by the Church. But the Enlightenment eventually comes about. Now, the Enlightenment We do have new access at this point to a lot of the classic works that had been lost and that were preserved by monasteries or found in Greece and so forth. We do have a return to a lot of the knowledge that had been lost by a lot of people for the most part, and built on. On the plus side of the Enlightenment, there are a lot of great scientific advancements because of that, and we still are living in that legacy today, one of the many legacies of the Enlightenment we live in. On the negative side, though, the Enlightenment, particularly in Europe, really set about the mainstream idea, or making the idea mainstream, of atheism. Now, before I get into that, let me just broach the subject that I'm particularly talking about Europe here, because in America, of course, the Enlightenment, we as United States citizens, we can trace our government back to our founding fathers, who were immensely inspired by the Enlightenment ideals. Thomas Jefferson is writing the Declaration of Independence based on the ideas of John Locke. Certainly George Washington, the father of our country, certainly James Madison, the father of our Constitution, would be considered Enlightenment individuals. The thing about the United States, though, the New World here, the Enlightenment over here never divorced itself from the idea of God. Now, it's true that a lot of our founding fathers wouldn't really consider themselves Christian in any sort of traditional way, but at the most, they were at least deists. Deists like Jefferson and so forth still believed in a creator God, a creator God who was good, a good creator God who set the creation, his world, up according to certain laws and certain natural orders and so forth, and that it was our job to learn those laws and orders, but submit to them as well. And that's a natural order, laws like gravity and so forth, but also a moral order. That was involved in the idea of deism as well. Certainly not the exact same moral order of, say, the Christian church or something like that, but still, it was there. And I would argue that that is why the United States still exists today, founded on Enlightenment values, but did not divorce itself from the idea of a creator. Now, you can certainly say we've done that now. We can talk about the repercussions that have happened since then and so forth. That wasn't the case in Europe, though. About a decade or so after our American Revolution, founded on the ideals of the Enlightenment, France had its French Revolution. Now, remember I said that France was considered the eldest daughter of the church. At the time, the French were living under a monarchy, and the church itself held sway a lot in the government. Catholic churches held sway a lot in the government of France. And both the monarchy and the church, there was obviously heavy corruption in that as well, a lot of mismanagement. And the people rise up according to these Enlightenment ideals. And the leaders of the Enlightenment fully embrace this idea of atheism, though. We need to divorce ourselves from the church, any idea of a monarchy who rules by divine right. So we need to cut off we're all, let's really develop in our own rights and so forth. And it ends in horror. The French Revolution, you can look up some stuff and, find some information about it. It's just, eventually it ends in what's called the Reign of Terror. At first, it's, they're beheading their leaders, their king, their so forth. Not just killing, though, or beheading, torturing, raping, dismembering. I mean, it's horrible, the frenzy of anger that people get worked up into, until eventually even the leaders of the revolution themselves are executed by the revolution and murdered and so forth by the revolution. So it becomes just a giant bloodbath. And one of the things that happens in it, you have writers like the Marquis de Sade, the man who we get the word sadism from, writing all of these horribly licentious, evil texts about not just free love or sex, but rape and murder, all together within it. Because that's this logical trajectory. There's what's called the sex horror trajectory. Once you say, in the Enlightenment, and the European Enlightenment anyway, many of the thinkers were saying, let's do away with any moral order. Let's just embrace our own natures, our own natural natures. Let's look at science, nature, and let's look at our natural, motives and drives as well, which of course sexual drives are going to be the part of that. And we'll talk about that, some individual specific cases here in a moment, but it always leads to horror. It always leads to terror, because in the minute one person says, I am very justified in totally objectifying you and using you for my pleasure, there's the escalation factor. You think about it like with people who get hooked on pornography, for example, that thing I was looking at before doesn't do it for me. I need something a little more extreme, a little more extreme. And if you've allowed yourself to think of somebody else as just an object to give you sexual pleasure, eventually you're torturing, eventually you're murdering, just to get that little bit more extreme kick and so forth. It happened. It's historical. Now, the French Revolution, by the time of our night in 1816, is pretty much over. Napoleon had come to power, even lost power and so forth. But before we talk about Mary Shelley and Percy and Lord Byron, we need to say a little bit about their parents. William Godwin, Mary, who would eventually be called Mary Shelley, her father, William Godwin, was a British man and an Enlightenment thinker. See, when the revolution's going on in France, Britain had already had little mini revolutions in terms of their monarchy. They were well on the way to a constitutional monarchy. People would argue about when this and that happened and so forth. But they weren't tyrannically ruled by a king and a church in the same way or to the extent that France was. So Britain as a whole looked on the French Revolution with a good bit of horror. They were aghast at all these things that were happening. Look what happens when you just deny your king and so forth. But you did have Enlightenment thinkers within Britain who were championing the French Revolution and these values and these ideas from the Enlightenment. William Godwin was one of them. He wrote a very famous pamphlet, he wrote some books and whatnot, talking about how we need to throw off traditional values, whether that's political, even religious. We need to throw off this idea of a Christian system of morals, of order. We need to throw off institutions like marriage. Marriage is so ridiculous. People should just be free to, go where their heart leads them and so forth. Mary Wollstonecraft, who would eventually be Mary Shelley's mother, was also an Enlightenment thinker. Now, she is constantly sort of strawmanned up by feminist theory as their great, wonderful matriarch, when many of the things she believed in, they would even be horrified by. But she did write a vindication of the rights of man and eventually a vindication of the rights of men and women. She believed in this Enlightenment ideal as well. In fact, she, long before she meets William Godwin, she even goes to Paris while the French Revolution is taking place with the idea that she's going to stick it to society by having an affair. She's going to go to France where it would be more socially acceptable to have an affair. And she's going to have this affair with a man and just sort of stick it to traditional society. She does that. She goes to Paris and is immediately struck by the danger there. I mean, people are being murdered and tortured right outside her window. She meets this American, I forget his first name, but his last name is Imlay, I-M-L-Y, and they start their affair. Interestingly enough, as the French Revolution becomes more and more dangerous, foreigners from Britain in particular are they're targeted in a lot of ways. So here we have Imlay and Mary Wollstonecraft, who don't believe in the idea of marriage, who are doing what they're doing in their affair just to stick it to marriage. They go to the American embassy, because Imlay is American, and register Mary Wollstonecraft as his wife. They don't actually get married, but they register as his wife so that she can suddenly be Mrs. Imlay, the American, instead of Mary Wollstonecraft, the British, citizen who would have been, let's say, at the very least, in the best case, would have been ousted from the country. So they stay there, and then Mary Wollstonecraft is pregnant. Imlay leaves, abandons her, which is perfectly in line with the ideals and the philosophies that the two espoused to each other when they got together. But he abandons her there. So Wollstonecraft is left there, eventually has her daughter there in this incredibly dangerous climate in this country. And she writes a lot of heartbreaking letters to him, trying to make him understand that, you do actually have a commitment to me that you must honor and so forth. So a lot of, even, when they try to live these ideals, they start to see how they break apart. Eventually, Mary Wollstonecraft makes it back to Britain, not before she tries to kill herself. Actually, twice. She tries to kill herself again in Britain. But eventually she meets William Godwin. Now, William Godwin at this point has a lot of egg on his face. Remember, he's been writing in support of the French Revolution. By now, the reign of terror has taken place. Like everybody, it's just not even a question anymore. You can look and see that the French Revolution was a horribly bloody, terrible thing to happen. The way the Enlightenment thinkers try to justify it, though, is they say, well, look, a lot of horrible things happened and they shouldn't have happened. But the French people were under so much tyranny for so long that they really just had to get that out of their system. So it's okay if you just kept letting it, develop. If the French Revolution had been allowed to breathe, they would have gotten that out of their system and eventually settled down into our wonderful communist utopia or whatever that the Enlightenment was trying to eventually work toward, or these Enlightenment thinkers, which were trying to eventually work toward. So Godwin had a good deal of egg on his face, but he's trying to maintain as much as possible. Wollstonecraft, coming back to English society as a unwed mother, has a bit of problems to work out herself. She meets William Godwin, sparks fly. Here's the interesting thing, they decide to get married. Again, flies in the face of everything the two of them believe. Why would they try to do this? But they go to the English church, the Anglican church, and have become married within the English church. So they're married. And then, of course, Mary Shelley is born. Mary Wollstonecraft dies within a month after Mary is born. It's believed that she, if you look at the documentation and whatnot at the time, letters and such, she dies from an infection that she caught from the birth. They didn't have the most sterile conditions. Childbirth was a perilous thing for a lot of women and so forth. So her mother dies. Young Mary grows up with her father there. Her father eventually remarries and has a half-sister who is what's believed to be a half-sister for Mary. Her name is Claire. Now we go ahead and call her Claire Claremont, though, because it eventually comes out that William wasn't the father. She is his new wife and had this child by another man. Again, once you throw out these traditional values and institutions, chaos, right? So, but it's believed at the time, and that's important, or at least it's asserted at the time, that Claire is Mary's half-sister by William. Growing up there. Okay. Now we have a young Percy Shelley, who, in a lot of ways, Mary eventually based Victor Frankenstein on Percy. He grows up experimenting on his sisters. They are, in some ways, he's just very sociopathic, using them, electrocuting them, playing out these different experiments. They're all very inspired or intrigued by galvanism, and the idea of harnessing lightning, which of course comes from Ben Franklin at first, the ideas of it and such. He starts to write. He is what's called part of the second generation of the Romantics. The Romantic era, it's a group of writers, poets, this era we look back on, and it's often misleadingly described as sort of a reaction against the Enlightenment. Now, that's true enough for the first generation of the Romantics, what are called the light Romantics. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, William Blake. They are very much saying, look, you can't deny that we have passion and emotions. We should very much investigate and allow our passions and our emotions and our feelings and our soul. They fly in the face of the Enlightenment and really go back to following our feelings back to a God, whether that's a Christian God or just the idea of a God, but they do believe in a creator God who is good. This is the first generation of Romantics in Britain. Percy is part of the second generation of Romantics. In terms of the writers, they're usually represented by Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Keats, Keats. I mixed up his first name there. But the second generation of Romantics love the idea of the Enlightenment, that we should throw off the idea of God, that we should throw off the idea of these traditional values, marriage and government and all these things. We should just be free to do whatever we want. They love that idea. And Percy wasn't a wonderful poet. He truly is. You can look at his poetry. All of these individuals were masterful writers. They had a lot of great talent. But Percy was a pretty sick individual. He eventually marries a young woman named Harriet and tries to get her to form a commune with him, of which they can all share wives. He writes to a school teacher and starts sort of a affair by pen pal going on with her, has her leave her job and move to him so he can start this sort of commune, but his wife won't have any of it. So this poor school teacher woman is left without a job, abandoned, and so forth. He tries to get his wife to sleep with some of his friends. He loves this idea of free love. He reads a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, Adam Weishaupt, I always pronounce his name wrong, who talks about among others. You can go a lot deeper into these topics. Obviously, I'm crushing semesters upon semesters into just a 20-minute talk here, 30-minute talk, whatever. But he is enamored with this idea that sort of starts to blend the occultism into ideas of the Enlightenment. We can perceive, we can bring to fruition our ideas and our longings for revolution if we engage in actions that drastically go against the previous order. So he was very much, Percy's very much into the ideas of incest and so forth. He goes to pay homage to Godwin because he likes Godwin's works, and he meets Mary. Mary is a great deal younger than him, I think 14 or 16 or something at the first point when they meet. He's about 20-ish, and they begin an affair. Mary and Percy begin an affair. William Godwin is horrified by this. You would think he'd be okay with it, right? Mr. Free Love, Mr. What's Marriage, and all of that. But he's horrified by it. Mary gets pregnant by Percy and gives birth to a baby girl who's eventually, I can't remember if she was stillborn or she dies shortly after the birth, which devastates Mary. All the while, Percy's still married to Harriet and having kids by her. Eventually, Percy tries to kill himself a couple of times because he just can't live without Mary, can't live without her. Eventually, he absconds with Mary and they run away to Europe. They bring along Mary's half-sister, Claire, who I mentioned, considered, everyone thinks she's her half-sister, because Percy wants a little menage a trois with these sisters, again, bringing that incestuous kind of a cultish moment to bring his revolutionary ideas into fruition. Percy has Claire write to Lord Byron to develop Lord Byron's the other great, second generation romantic author of the day, poet of the day, to develop an affair with him so that Claire and Lord Byron have a thing, because Percy would like to bring Lord Byron into this sort of wife swapping communal, ritualistic thing that he wants to have there. Now, Lord Byron's not necessarily into that, but he's not going to turn down a free woman, throwing herself at him. Lord Byron's got his own issues. He has had a child with his sister, his own incestuous issues in England. So much controversy. Again, I'm just skating over this. You can go through many specifics. Every time I talk about anything on my channel, there's always comments going, I know stuff too. I can't believe you didn't talk about this. Obviously, guys, I'm skating over this, trying to sum up, just give you the overall narrative. Lord Byron, a lot of controversy, famous writer. They really are, the poets in those days are the rock stars of the day. They don't have television. They don't have radio. They don't have music that can be, given around, but they do have paper. And so poems can be circulated and so forth. So they are the rock stars of the day, Percy and Byron in particular. So Byron, a lot of controversy, slept with his sister. He leaves and goes to Europe as well to escape the controversy. His family pays this young doctor by the name of John Polidori to go with him. Polidori is a very talented doctor of the time, but you have to be a certain age. You have to be 20-something, and John Polidori isn't quite that. I think he's only 20 at this point, in order to practice medicine and actually open up your own practice and whatnot in England. So at least the Byron, Lord Byron's family pays John Polidori to attend Lord Byron on this journey to Europe. Hopefully he won't do anything silly like kill himself because he misses his sister wife. So anyway, that's where John Polidori and Lord Byron are in Switzerland at the time. Percy, with designs in his own mind for what's going to take place, has Mary and Claire accompanying him there. They all stay in this castle. As I said before, dark, stormy, cold summer. There's stories of the castle to the south of them where a very real Dr. Frankenstein is said to have, tried to make these experiments and dig up bodies and all of these stories. Ideas of galvanism and harnessing lightning as sort of the source of life are in the ether at the time. Mary's taking all of this in. This night changes everything. A lot of things happen on this night. Or maybe a space of nights if you want to stretch it over there. It's really only a few weeks that all of them stay together. Eventually some other individuals come and Percy and Mary end up leaving and whatnot. But it's an important moment because, like I said, the idea for the story of Frankenstein's developed, and the idea of the vampire, which would go on to inspire Dracula in many ways, is developed. We'll talk more about Dracula in particular when we actually start to talk about the novel Bram Stoker's Dracula and the Universal films and some of the ways Dracula has influenced our culture. We will get to that. Some on this podcast and also a lot on my own channel, some of the live streams and videos and so forth. But for Mary's part, she starts to suddenly realize a little bit that Percy's affections maybe aren't unconditional. They're taking a lot of laudanum. It's a drug-fueled orgy fest, in a lot of ways there at that castle in the summer. Percy has a vision of Mary with eyes where her nipples should be, and this horrifies him, makes him run out of the room. And of course, you can psychoanalyze that in a lot of ways. I mean, this is the person he's trying to objectify or use who's suddenly looking back to him. The part of her that he's trying to objectify and use, what is supposed to be the life-giving, nurturing part of her, is looking back at him, sort of a judgmental eye. We can psychoanalyze it. Maybe that's not your thing, whatever. But just really freaky things are going on here, and he's horrified by Mary for a time. He's still sleeping with Claire at the same time, And you can see in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein a lot of guilt and even criticism a little bit. Now, she never wrote about this or said this openly, but it's really there in the book. When they do eventually go back to Britain, Fanny Imlay, Mary Shelley's half-sister, if you remember, she's the child that Mary Wollstonecraft bore while she was in France during the French Revolution at the time. She was abandoned with this child. They get back to Britain, and Fanny, her half-sister, kills herself. And she leaves a note. It's because she didn't feel like she was a second-class citizen in the family and, didn't really feel that unconditional sense of love. Because, again, that family's all about just, going out for themselves and to heck with this traditional values like family and so forth. You follow your own urges and so forth. Fanny Imlay kills herself. Later, and that's in October of that year. So this was the summer of 1816. October, Fanny, Mary's half-sister, kills herself. In December, Percy's wife, whom he ran away from with another woman, is found dead, drowned in the river, who has killed herself as well. Mere days after Percy's wife is found dead, having killed herself, Mary and Percy get married in the English church. And there's some thoughts as to why they did that. Mary insisted upon it. We know that much. But maybe it was because Percy could more easily gain rights to his children he had with Harriet if they were married and so forth. Percy blames Harriet's suicide on her family. Her family didn't treat her right. Like, are you kidding me? If anybody's just, guilty of not treating her right, it's you dog. So there's a lot of guilt in Mary. And you can see this come through in the themes of Frankenstein once she writes it all out and puts it together. There's the responsibility a creator owes to their creation. The Frichter gives life to this being and drops the ball on all the responsibility he owes to it, and the horror that ensues and the things, and can't you lay that at the feet of Victor? And where's the culpability for Victor and the things he did and so forth? I mean, you really dig into it and can go a great distance with that. It's a fascinating piece. It's also an indictment. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an indictment in many ways on this sort of godless Enlightenment thinking. We're going to stop there. We're not really going to dig too much deeper into Frankenstein yet, because that'll be for future. I don't know exactly where this divisions are going to end up for the next episode of this podcast, but you can follow me on YouTube, Professor Geek, and we'll be talking about this a lot more, going in order, delving into Frankenstein a bit more, eventually looking at Dracula and how that came from Polidori and so forth. So we're going to continue to look at that. But these creatures, even if you're not into a Frankenstein or Dracula story, the anxieties that they represent, because horror holds up a mirror to our anxieties, even in a culture that won't admit it. If you revel in stories where your monster is like this, whether you admit it or not, there's some anxiety about, hey, maybe there's a lot of zombie movies right now. Maybe there's a little bit of anxiety about all of our scientific advancements in gene splicing and disease cultivation and so forth. So horror doesn't lie. The popular horror is going to tell the tale of what's going on in society. And today, living in our society, which is still very much a product of the Enlightenment, it's still with us today, its philosophies and so forth, we can trace a lot of our anxieties and our horror stories back to the original horror stories originally spawned by the Enlightenment. That one night, that one fateful magic night, maybe a few nights, no more than a week at least, in this castle, in this dark, cold, stormy summer, in which these brilliantly talented young people are just living a debaucherous lifestyle. And the guilt, the fear, the anxiety, blasts through their subconscious and creates these stories. It's fascinating. It really is fascinating.